For 1,000 years, the Church told the world that money was the root of all evil, and then it became the richest institution in human history. While peasants prayed for bread, bishops dined on silver plates. While monks preached poverty, the Vatican stored gold in vaults deeper than catacombs, and when they said you can't buy your way into heaven, they were lying, because business was booming. They sold forgiveness, they rented salvation, they taxed the afterlife. From the blood-soaked coins of crusaders to the silent bribes of kings, God's house had turned into Europe's most profitable bank. The currency, guilt, the product, redemption, and the marketing, divine. The Church didn't just lose to money, it merged with it. Because behind every relic, every crusade, every cathedral, and was an invoice. They said faith could move mountains. Turns out gold could build them. This is the story of how holiness became a business model, and how the same men who condemned greed learned to count faster than any merchant alive. Welcome to the Rise of the Bourgeoisie, Episode 2, The Church versus Money, How God Lost to Gold. Before we begin, a quick warning. This story is not for the faithful. It's for those who've ever wondered how God became an accountant. If you haven't seen the first episode, From Dirt to Gold, go watch it after this one. That's where the merchants rise from the mud to challenge kings and priests. This here is where the priests fight back and lose. Because in the Middle Ages, the Church didn't just rule souls. It ruled everything: the land, the laws, the fear of the afterlife. Its words could crown a king or condemn a continent. And for centuries, it told the world that money was evil, until the moment it realized evil pays better than good. What followed wasn't faith, it was finance. And by the time it was over, salvation had a price tag and sin had a receipt. And don't miss the next episode, When Gold Replaced God, where this unholy marriage between greed and grace becomes the foundation of our modern world. For centuries, priests stood in pulpits warning that greed would drag your soul straight to hell. They said gold was cursed, the metal of Judas, the devil's reflection in daylight. To want too much was to risk eternal fire. And yet, somehow the Church always had plenty of it. In every city, every village, every monastery, gold gleamed from the very hands that condemned it. The cathedrals that preached humility sparkled like palaces. Their walls were lined with marble, their ceilings with heaven itself, painted, of course, by artists who demanded payment in advance. It was a strange kind of poverty. The monks were barefoot, yes, but they walked on floors of gold leaf. The logic was divine. We don't own it, they said. It belongs to God. Conveniently, only they had the keys to his treasury. In sermons, they spoke of sinners who chased profit instead of piety. In confession, they forgave them for a small donation. And when a merchant offered 10 silver coins, the priest would smile and whisper, "May the Lord multiply your generosity." He usually did. The Church had mastered the oldest trick in the book: guilt as revenue. The poorer you felt, the richer they became. Every sermon was both a warning and an advertisement. You sinned on Monday, paid on Sunday, and the cycle continued. Still, there were rules, at least on paper. Charging interest was a mortal sin. So instead, they invented fees. Selling forgiveness was forbidden, so they renamed it donations. Lying to God was unthinkable, so they lied for him. The medieval world didn't question it. Who would dare accuse the men who spoke for heaven? The bishop could condemn greed in public and invest in land by night. The abbot could preach sacrifice while hoarding relics like a collector. It wasn't hypocrisy, it was divine strategy. The irony is that many priests genuinely believed they were serving God. They convinced themselves that wealth was a test, a tool to glorify the divine. A poor man with gold was a sinner. A bishop with gold was a steward of God's beauty. See the difference? Neither did the peasants, but they clapped anyway, because questioning the Church was blasphemy, and blasphemy got you burned. In towns, a new class began to listen carefully: the merchants. They watched the Church condemn them for selling goods while selling salvation. They heard the word sin and thought, business opportunity. So they learned from the masters. They copied the Church's model: emotional manipulation, exclusive products, and loyalty built on fear. The clergy had invented branding centuries before capitalism had a name. To control money, the Church first controlled desire. They told people that heaven was priceless, but access to it came with a small maintenance fee. Every candle lit, every mass sung, every prayer whispered for the dead had a price list attached. and as people paid to escape purgatory, priests smiled like bankers counting interest. But here's the twist. It worked. Faith was the only economy that never crashed. Wars ended, kingdoms fell, but the church's profits only grew. They didn't need to conquer land. They conquered conscience. Every coin dropped into a collection plate was proof that fear could be monetized, and every time someone prayed for forgiveness, the church learned something priceless, that salvation wasn't about belief, it was about control. The sin of greed, it turned out, wasn't killing the church. It was feeding it, and soon it would feed an entire system that made money holy. It started with a simple idea. If sin had a price, why not charge for it? At first it sounded absurd. You can't buy forgiveness, the priest said. Then they realized you could, if you called it something else. Enter the indulgence, the most brilliant marketing invention in human history, a golden ticket for the guilty. One payment, and your time in purgatory could be significantly reduced. 2 payments, and you might skip the line entirely. Suddenly, forgiveness had a business model. Posters appeared across towns. Preachers toured like rock stars, promising salvation for silver. People lined up, crying, praying, paying. Every time a coin in the coffer rings, one friar said, a soul from purgatory springs. It rhymed. It sold. The church had found a way to monetize eternity. No army could conquer like guilt armed with a price list. Merchants sold spices. The church sold hope. Guess which product never expired? Soon, salvation became a marketplace. You could buy prayers, blessings, relics, or an entire chapel in your name. You could even prepay for your sins, a sort of spiritual insurance policy. There were loyalty programs too. Donate often enough, and a bishop might visit your town. Sponsor a crusade and your whole family got fast-tracked to paradise. Forgiveness was scalable, and business was booming. But indulgences weren't the only miracle on sale. There were relics. Oh, the relics. Everyone wanted a piece of the divine, and the supply never seemed to run out. You could buy a splinter from the true cross, a feather from an angel, or a vial of Mary's tears. One church claimed to have 3 skulls of John the Baptist, all authentic, of course. Markets for holiness appeared everywhere. In Paris, a merchant sold bones so often he was nicknamed Saint Supplier. In Rome, pilgrims could purchase blessings in bulk. In Germany, a prince displayed over 19,000 relics, a spiritual warehouse of bones and dust. Each one came with a certificate, signed by a bishop who couldn't read Latin but could count money just fine. People didn't question it. They were terrified of hell, desperate for comfort, and ready to believe anything wrapped in gold leaf. Faith was no longer about the unseen, it was about the purchased. And here's the genius. The church didn't sell lies. They sold meaning. A relic wasn't just a bone, it was a story. A prayer wasn't just a chant, it was insurance. Each coin dropped into the plate was a promise that your suffering had value. That's what made it beautiful and terrifying. The more people paid, the more they felt invested in their salvation. The church had created the perfect psychological trap. You had to believe it was real because you'd already paid for it. Soon, Europe's economy of sin was unstoppable. Popes built basilicas with the profits. Priests grew fat from donations, and commoners, drowning in debt, believed they were buying their way out of divine bankruptcy. It was capitalism before capitalism, consumerism before advertising. Religion turned into retail. The church became the first corporation, and God became its brand. But the real power wasn't in the money, it was in the narrative. For the first time in history, a system existed that could turn guilt into gold. You didn't have to conquer or invent. You just had to convince people that their souls needed management. And the result was a machine that no king could rival, an empire of invisible debt, paid in fear, measured in coins, and renewed every Sunday. The merchants of Europe watched and learned. They saw how the church sold not just products but purpose. They realized that control wasn't about ownership, it was about belief. And in that moment, the seeds of modern capitalism were planted, not in a market, but in a monastery. Because if salvation could be sold, then anything could. They called themselves the Knights Templar, warriors of Christ, defenders of the Holy Land, guardians of the faith. But somewhere between Jerusalem and Paris, they became something else entirely, the world's first international bankers. It started innocently enough. Pilgrims traveling to the east were constantly robbed, murdered, or cheated on the road, so the Templars offered a service. safety. You could deposit your gold in one Templar church in Europe and withdraw it in the Holy Land. A miracle. No more carrying coins across deserts or seas. They invented the medieval credit system and in doing so, turned salvation into a franchise. Within decades, they owned castles, fleets, and fortresses. Kings borrowed from them. Popes blessed them. Every crusade marched on Templar money. Their white mantles with red crosses became the logo of divine finance. By the 13th century, they were untouchable. They collected taxes, issued loans, and stored royal treasures. Even the Vatican kept gold in their vaults. And while kings fought over land, the Templars fought over interest rates. In the name of God, they created the first banking network. Their ledgers were written in secret codes. Their clerks spoke in whispers. Their castles doubled as counting houses. Behind the altar, there was always a safe. Of course, they swore poverty. They took vows of chastity and obedience. But their poverty included vineyards, mines, and entire islands. And their obedience applied mostly to God's profit margin. No one dared challenge them until one king did. Philip IV of France, a man drowning in debt, decided he'd had enough of paying interest to his own holy servants. On a cold Friday, October 13, 1307, his soldiers surrounded every Templar house in France. The knights were dragged out, tortured, and accused of heresy. They confessed to worshipping idols, to spitting on the cross, to secret orgies and demonic rituals. Most of it was fiction, but the gold, that part was real, and it was gone. Philip seized their properties, burned their leaders, and erased their name. But the money vanished. Some say it was hidden. Others say it had already been transferred to Italy, because by then, new players had entered the holy game, the papal bankers. Families like the Medici in Florence and the Fuggers in Germany learned from the Templars' fall. They wouldn't wear armor. They'd wear silk. They wouldn't fight wars. They'd finance them. The church condemned usury, charging interest. So the bankers simply changed the words. They called it service fees, or compensations, or blessings. The popes signed off on it because, conveniently, they needed the loans. By the 14th century, the Vatican was no longer the heart of faith. It was the headquarters of Europe's most sophisticated financial system. Every crusade, every cathedral, every papal election had a sponsor. Heaven itself had investors. And somewhere between divine purpose and profit, religion stopped being about God and started being about guarantees. The bankers became the new priests. Their temples were counting houses. Their holy books were ledgers. Their sacraments were signatures. But they still spoke the language of salvation. Every loan was a blessing. Every interest payment a small sacrifice. They had taken the symbols of the church, from the cross, the chalice, the prayer, and turned them into contracts. And the popes didn't resist. They joined. Some became literal business partners. They invested in trade, in mining, even in the slave routes of the future. The same men who preached against greed were funding the dawn of capitalism, wrapped in incense and Latin. When people said God works in mysterious ways, they didn't realize one of those ways was compound interest. The Templars had been destroyed for being too powerful, but the system they created never died. It changed its name, put on robes of respectability, and moved to Rome. And from that moment on, the church didn't just bless money, it became money. There was a time when the sight of gold made men tremble with guilt. By the 14th century, it made them feel chosen. The church had done the impossible. It turned greed into grace. The logic was simple and diabolically brilliant. If everything on earth belonged to God, then gold must too. And if gold rewarded hard work and faith, then success was no longer sin. It was proof of divine favor. The merchant who got rich, God's blessing. The bishop with jewels, God's glory. The poor peasant starving outside the cathedral, well, God's mysterious plan. Europe was drunk on this theology of profit. Priests preached that diligence and thrift were virtues. Monks who once fled temptation now managed vineyards and traded wool. Even the language changed. Charity became investment. Faith became trust. Virtue became credit. In sermons, preachers spoke of the good Christian merchant, the man who worked hard, feared God, and paid tithes on time. They didn't mention that his hands were stained with slave labor and stolen land, only that his donations sparkled nicely on the altar. This new alliance between God and gold reshaped everything. The church no longer feared the bourgeoisie. It courted them. Merchants funded cathedrals and bought themselves into heaven, brick by brick. Their names were carved into stained glass, immortalized beside saints they'd never met. Every beam of light passing through those windows was a sermon. We are rich because God loves us. The irony? The same doctrine that once damned the merchants was now their marketing strategy. They had found religion, not in prayer but in profit. By the late Middle Ages, the line between a bishop and a banker had vanished completely. Their robes were different, but their gods were the same: gold and glory. In Italy, families like the Medici built chapels not to honor Christ, but to immortalize their credit. In Flanders, guildmasters sponsored icons of the Virgin Mary holding a coin instead of a flower. And in Rome, popes commissioned frescoes that cost more than entire towns. It was no longer blasphemy, it was branding. Behind the hymns and halos there was a machine, the first true corporate religion. Its motto was as divine as it was cynical. If God rewards the good and the good prosper, then the rich must be holy. It was a message tailor-made for a rising middle class, desperate to feel righteous. And it worked. The bourgeoisie became Europe's new priests of ambition. They preached a silent gospel. That morality could be measured in possessions. That heaven favored those who built higher, earned more and gave back, as long as they gave publicly. The church in turn adopted their language. Profit was now providence. Trade was God's design. Debt was divine order. Together they created the first moral justification for inequality and called it balance. But beneath all the pious words and golden altars, something had shifted forever. The medieval world had believed in miracles. Now it believed in math. The language of faith had become accounting, and the sacred had become profitable. When gold became holy, the church no longer guided souls. It managed assets. The bourgeoisie no longer feared damnation. They financed redemption. And in that unholy harmony, the old world quietly died. Because when heaven and earth finally agreed on the same currency, there was no going back. By the end of the Middle Ages, salvation had become the most profitable business in Europe. Every fear had a price. Every sin had a solution. Every soul was a potential customer. The system was flawless. The church created the guilt, and the merchants handled the payments. You sinned, they sold forgiveness. You died, they sold prayers. You feared hell, they sold you hope. It was capitalism's first subscription service. Repent, renew, repeat. People worked their entire lives not for comfort or wealth, but to afford their own redemption. They donated farms, jewels, even children to monasteries, hoping to buy a shorter stay in purgatory. Every man was both debtor and believer. Every woman was both victim and client. The church had mastered emotional marketing long before Madison Avenue existed. Its billboards were cathedrals. Its slogan, eternal peace, limited offer. And for those who couldn't pay in gold, there was always labor. Peasants built basilicas stone by stone, unpaid, told their suffering was sacred. Merchants bankrolled crusades in exchange for spiritual partnership. The poor gave their sweat, the rich gave their silver, and both believed they were making deposits in Heaven's bank. But Heaven's bank had no withdrawals. Behind the altars and incense, the math was brutally clear. The church collected, the people paid. The debt, original sin, never expired. It was divine finance at its finest, an infinite cycle of guilt-powered revenue. And just like that, Europe had discovered something extraordinary, that you could control an entire civilization, not with armies, but with conscience. By the 15th century, faith had been fully monetized. The Vatican became the world's most powerful corporation, complete with CEOs, the popes, subsidiaries, the monasteries, and local franchises, the parish priests. Merchants no longer feared excommunication. They feared bad investments. The church no longer worried about heresy. It worried about inflation. Even art became advertising. Michelangelo's frescoes weren't just beauty. They were propaganda. Each brushstroke whispered, "Look what God's money can buy." But beneath the marble and miracles, a quiet rebellion was brewing. A few monks began to whisper that something felt wrong, that maybe heaven shouldn't have a price list, that perhaps faith had turned into fraud. One of them would later nail his thoughts to a door, and Europe would explode. But that's another story. For now, in the dying light of the Middle Ages, the business of salvation stood unchallenged. It had created the perfect loop, a moral machine that fed on fear and called it virtue, a system so complete that even those who knew it was corrupt couldn't escape it. Because it worked. People found comfort in paying, they found peace in debt, and the church, Well, it found heaven on earth. As gold piled up in Rome, the streets outside filled with beggars. The faithful starved in the shadow of cathedrals their money had built, and the priests, wrapped in silk, preached that poverty was holy, just not their poverty. It was the ultimate miracle, the transformation of faith into finance, of redemption into revenue, of humanity's deepest fear, death, into the most enduring business model ever created, a business still open today. Because the church didn't just teach Europe how to believe, it taught it how to sell belief, and the merchants who once envied its power would soon perfect its methods, in banks, in empires, in corporations, all born from the same medieval truth, that there is no greater profit than the price of the soul. For centuries they told the world that salvation was priceless, and then they sold it, receipt included. In the end, the church didn't lose to greed. It learned from it, it baptized it, and in doing so, it created a system more powerful than any kingdom, a faith that ran on fear, guilt, and gold. The merchants watched, took notes, and built the future. They saw how confession could be turned into credit, how sin could become supply, and how even God could be branded. The church had taught them the first rule of the new world: nothing is sacred until it's profitable. And as the candles flickered inside marble cathedrals, a new dawn was rising outside, one that no pope could bless or ban. The age of prayer was ending. The age of payment had begun. In the next chapter of The Rise of the Bourgeoisie, you'll see how gold didn't just replace God, it became him.